David Harper stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse, the city skyline sparkling like jewels beneath him. He had everything he'd ever wanted: a thriving business empire, a luxurious lifestyle, and soon, a perfect marriage to Claire Whitmore, a woman whose grace and pedigree matched his ambition. But as he sipped a glass of vintage whiskey, a shadow of dissatisfaction lingered in his mind. The name Amara Johnson echoed faintly, uninvited but persistent. She had been his partner during the hardest years of his life, a source of unwavering belief when his dreams were still fragile. Yet when those dreams demanded sacrifices, she had refused to stand by him. Amara's departure had been a scar David had buried beneath layers of success, but it was one he couldn't forget. Now, standing on the pinnacle of achievement, David's thoughts turned bitter. How poetic would it be, he mused, for Amara to see what she'd walked away from, to sit amidst the glittering crowd at his wedding and witness how far he'd come without her? He reached for the envelope on his desk, a bespoke wedding invitation, embossed with gold lettering. Her name sat boldly on the front, Miss Amara Johnson. With a call to his assistant, David made sure the invitation would be delivered in person. His instructions were clear and firm. Make certain she gets it directly. Are you sure, Mr. Harper? His assistant ventured cautiously. David turned, his gaze sharp and unyielding. I've never been more sure of anything. She needs to see this. As the assistant left, David downed the rest of his drink. A faint smirk crossed his lips. This is how she'll know, he murmured to himself. She lost. Amara Johnson stood at the easel in her modest studio, the afternoon light spilling through the window as she worked on her latest painting. The quiet hum of her surroundings was broken by a knock at the door. Setting down her brush, she wiped her hands on a cloth and opened the door to find a sharply dressed courier holding an ornate envelope. Delivery for Miss Amara Johnson, he said with a polite nod, handing it to her. Amara's brow furrowed as she took the envelope. Its weight was heavier than expected, the edges trimmed with gold, exuding an air of luxury she hadn't touched in years. Curiosity mingled with apprehension as she broke the seal. Her breath hitched. David Harper and Claire Whitmore request the honor of your presence. The words blurred momentarily as her chest tightened. Memories surged. David's laughter, his relentless ambition, the nights they spent dreaming of a shared future. And then the arguments, the feeling of being left behind as he chose success over their love. Her first instinct was to toss the invitation into the trash. What kind of man invited his ex to his wedding? Was this an olive branch or a taunt? But as the initial sting faded, a new emotion surfaced: resolve. She placed the invitation on her work table and stared at it for a moment, her mind churning. No, she whispered to herself, her voice steady. This isn't about him. It's about me. Amara knew she had changed. She wasn't the same person who walked away years ago. If David wanted her to witness his life now, she would, but not to crumble under his success. She turned to her laptop and booked a ticket. It was time to confront the past, on her terms. The grand estate was alive with the hum of preparations as guests began to arrive, each more elegantly dressed than the last. The driveway, lined with towering oak trees, was a parade of luxury cars and whispered greetings. Inside, the air buzzed with excitement, the kind reserved for the kind of wedding that would be talked about for years. Amara stepped out of the car at the entrance, the soft click of her heels against the cobblestone driveway, the only sound she could hear over the pounding of her heart. Dressed in a sleek emerald green gown, simple yet striking, she adjusted her clutch and took a deep breath. The grandeur of the estate loomed before her, imposing, beautiful, and undeniably intimidating. But Amara held her head high, her expression calm and composed. She wasn't here to blend into the shadows. As she walked through the ornate double doors into the lavishly decorated foyer, all eyes seemed to turn to her. Conversation stilled, replaced by curious murmurs. She felt the weight of their gazes, a mixture of admiration and scrutiny, but refused to falter. Is that Amara Johnson? Someone whispered. Yes, the ex, another replied, their voice low but audible enough to reach her ears. Amara's lips curved into a subtle, confident smile. If David had hoped she would feel small in this setting, he was sorely mistaken. A staff member approached her, guiding her toward the ballroom where the festivities were in full swing. As she stepped into the room, she was met with opulence at every turn. Crystal chandeliers casting a warm glow, tables adorned with intricate floral arrangements, and guests draped in designer couture. Her gaze swept across the room and landed on David, standing at the far end near Claire. He was impeccably dressed, his tailored suit a testament to his success. For a brief moment, their eyes met. David's composed demeanor faltered ever so slightly, his surprise poorly hidden behind a practiced smile. Amara didn't look away. Instead, she lifted her chin, exuding quiet confidence, and walked into the room as though she belonged. She had come prepared, not to seek closure or validation, but to remind herself of the strength she had built in his absence. Amara stood near one of the elegantly adorned tables, a glass of sparkling water in hand, as she engaged in conversation with a group of older guests. Her natural charm and sincerity made her stand out in a room filled with superficial pleasantries. One of the women, impeccably dressed in a lavender gown, leaned in with interest. "So, Amara, what have you been up to all these years? I hear you've been doing some incredible work." Amara smiled warmly. "I run a nonprofit that focuses on education and community support in underprivileged areas. We've built schools, provided scholarships, and helped set up small businesses for women in rural regions. It's been challenging, but incredibly rewarding." The small group of guests exchanged impressed glances. "That sounds extraordinary," a silver-haired gentleman said, his tone tinged with admiration. "To dedicate yourself to such causes, it must take immense strength and determination." "It does," Amara admitted, her voice steady, "but it also gives me a purpose. Seeing the impact, however small, reminds me that change is possible even in the most unlikely places." As she spoke, her words carried an undeniable authenticity that drew others closer. It wasn't just what she said, but how she said it, free of arrogance, filled with genuine passion. David, standing across the room with Claire, couldn't help but notice. His eyes narrowed as he watched Amara gesturing animatedly, the small group around her captivated. The tension in his chest grew as he caught snippets of their conversation. "She's remarkable," one of the guests murmured loud enough for David to hear. "So poised, so accomplished, you don't meet people like that every day." Claire glanced at David, sensing his unease. "She seems impressive," she said, her tone light but inquisitive. David forced a smile, his grip tightening around his champagne flute. "She's always had a way with words," he muttered, trying to sound indifferent. But deep down, David felt a pang of something he hadn't expected: uncertainty. Amara wasn't just holding her own in this world of wealth and prestige. She was shining in a way that overshadowed everything he had planned. As laughter rippled from her corner of the room, David realized this wasn't the outcome he had anticipated. Amara wasn't here to be humbled. She was here to show her strength, and she was doing it effortlessly. David stood stiffly near the head table, his eyes flickering back to Amara as she moved through the crowd with an ease that unnerved him. She wasn't supposed to blend in so effortlessly, let alone become the center of attention. Yet, there she was, graceful, composed, and undeniably captivating. He clenched his jaw, his polished exterior beginning to crack under the weight of her presence. The conversations drifting from her corner stung more than he wanted to admit. Words like inspiring, brilliant, and admirable reached his ears, each one cutting deeper. David shifted uncomfortably, his mind racing. This wasn't the script he had written. Amara was supposed to feel out of place, not thrive in this setting. Instead, it felt as though she had turned the tables entirely, making him question whether his success truly eclipsed hers. Claire, standing beside him, noticed his distraction. Her brows knitted together as she followed his gaze to Amara. "Who is she?" Claire asked casually, but there was an edge to her tone. David hesitated, his grip tightening around his glass. "Just someone I used to know," he replied, his voice carefully neutral. But Claire's sharp eyes lingered on him, her intuition stirring. She didn't say anything further, but the unspoken question hung heavy between them. The muffled chatter and laughter from the ballroom faded as David stepped out onto the balcony, the cool evening air biting against his skin. He gripped the wrought iron railing tightly, his thoughts racing. Amara had managed to infiltrate his carefully curated world without lifting a finger, her mere presence unsettling the balance he had worked so hard to maintain. As he stared out over the manicured gardens below, the sound of approaching footsteps made him turn. Amara stepped onto the balcony, her emerald dress catching the moonlight. Her expression was calm, unreadable, but there was an undeniable strength in her posture. "You wanted to talk?" she asked, her tone polite but distant. David hesitated, his jaw tightening. "Why did you come?" he demanded, his voice low but edged with frustration. Amara tilted her head slightly, unfazed by his tone. "You invited me, remember?" His eyes narrowed. "You didn't have to accept. What are you trying to prove, Amara? That you can walk in here and pretend like you belong in this world?" Her lips quirked into a faint smile, a mixture of amusement and exasperation. "I don't need to prove anything, David. Least of all to you." Her words stung more than he cared to admit. "You think you've got it all figured out, don't you?" he snapped. "Coming here, acting like you're above all of this, above me." Amara crossed her arms, her gaze steady. "I'm not here to compete with you, David. That's your game, not mine." The calmness in her voice only fueled his irritation. "This isn't a game," he shot back. "Do you even realize what you walked away from? The life we could have had?" Amara's eyes softened slightly, but her tone remained firm. "I didn't walk away from a life, David. I walked away from a person who didn't see me for who I was. You didn't want a partner. You wanted someone to fit into your vision of success. I couldn't be that person." Her words hung heavy in the air, and for a moment, David was at a loss for how to respond. He had spent years justifying their breakup in his mind, convincing himself that Amara had been the one who failed to support him. Now, faced with her quiet strength, he felt his carefully constructed narrative unraveling. "You think you're better than me," he said finally, his voice quieter now, almost unsure. Amara shook her head, her expression softening. "No, David, I don't think I'm better than you. I just know who I am, and I'm not afraid to live that truth, even if it doesn't fit into your world." Her words struck a chord deep within him, one he hadn't realized existed. For years, he had avoided confronting the emptiness in his life, masking it with achievements and material success. But now, standing on this balcony with Amara, he couldn't ignore it any longer. As the silence between them grew, Amara stepped closer, her voice gentle but resolute. "David, whatever you're trying to prove to me, to yourself, it's not going to bring you peace. The only person you need to prove anything to is the one staring back at you in the mirror." She turned to leave, but paused at the door, glancing back at him one last time. "You invited me here to make me feel small, but all you've done is remind me of how far I've come. I hope one day you'll understand that true success isn't about what you have, it's about who you are." With that, she stepped back inside, leaving David alone on the balcony, the weight of her words settling over him like the chill of the night air. David stood frozen on the balcony, his thoughts a storm of emotions. He hadn't planned on this, on Amara confronting him with a truth he wasn't prepared to face. When she turned back to meet his gaze, there was no anger in her expression, no bitterness, only a calm, piercing honesty. "You've always cared too much about how people see you, David," Amara began, her voice steady but not unkind. "Even back then, it was never about what made you happy. It was about proving to the world that you mattered, that you were better than where you came from." Her words hit harder than he expected, peeling back layers he had long buried. He opened his mouth to respond, but she held up a hand to stop him. "I'm not saying that ambition is a bad thing," she continued. "But when you build your entire life around what other people think of you, you lose yourself. And that's exactly what happened to you, isn't it?" David clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. "You don't know me anymore, Amara," he replied, though his voice lacked conviction. "I know enough," she said simply, stepping closer. "I know the man who wanted to change the world, the one who believed in doing something meaningful. But somewhere along the way, you stopped chasing that dream and started chasing applause instead." Her words sliced through him, dredging up memories he had tried to suppress. He thought of the countless late nights he had spent strategizing not for purpose, but for profit. The relationships he had sacrificed for deals, the compromises he had made to climb higher. And yet, Here he was, standing atop the mountain, feeling nothing but emptiness. Amara's gaze softened, but she didn't hold back. "Do you even like the person you've become?" David flinched, as if the question physically struck him. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, but the truth was sitting heavy in his chest, suffocating him. "I've worked hard for this life," he said finally, his voice quieter now. "I know," Amara replied gently, "but have you lived it for yourself, or for the approval of others?" David looked away, unable to meet her gaze. The weight of her words pressed down on him, exposing cracks in the foundation of his carefully constructed world. "I thought I had everything," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But it doesn't feel like enough. It never has." Amara nodded, her expression soft but firm. "Because it's not about what you have, David. It's about who you are. Until you figure that out, nothing will ever feel like enough." For the first time in years, David didn't have a clever retort, a quick comeback, or a rehearsed justification. He simply stood there, the realization of his own emptiness sinking in. As Amara stepped back inside, leaving him alone on the balcony, David exhaled shakily. Her words echoed in his mind, stripping away the facade he had so desperately clung to. For the first time, he saw his life for what it truly was, a hollow shell waiting to be filled with something real. The estate gardens were transformed into a vision of perfection. Rows of white roses lined the marble pathway, leading to a grand archway draped in cascading greenery. The air was filled with the soft melody of a live string quartet, blending seamlessly with the gentle rustle of the afternoon breeze. Every detail, from the gilded chairs to the crystal goblets at the reception tables, screamed opulence and precision, David Harper's signature style. Guests took their seats, their murmured admiration adding to the atmosphere of grandeur. Claire appeared at the top of the aisle, radiant in a custom gown that seemed to shimmer with every step she took. Her face glowed with excitement, her eyes locked on David. But David wasn't fully present. Standing at the altar, he felt an ache in his chest that no amount of success or extravagance could dull. His mind drifted, not to the life he was about to begin with Claire, but to Amara. Her calm confidence, her genuine laughter, the way she had commanded attention at the rehearsal dinner the night before. He had seen her sitting near the back as the ceremony began, her emerald dress catching the sunlight. She hadn't tried to stand out, but her presence was impossible to ignore. The officiant's voice echoed, pulling David momentarily back to reality. "Do you, David Harper, take Claire Whitmore?" His mouth went dry. He looked at Claire, who stood before him, the picture of perfection. But something in her gaze reminded him of his carefully curated world, flawless, polished, but hollow. As the words swirled around him, his thoughts betrayed him once more. He thought of the passion Amara had spoken with, the life she had carved out for herself, free from pretense or validation. A part of him wondered if he had been chasing the wrong kind of success all along. The officiant prompted again, his tone more deliberate. "David?" David's gaze faltered. The weight of the moment pressed heavily on his shoulders. Around him, the crowd waited expectantly, but in the silence of his own mind, all he could hear was Amara's voice from the night before. "This isn't about me, David. It's about you." The words lingered like a ghost, a truth he had spent years avoiding. His fingers tightened around the ring in his hand, the metal cool against his clammy palm. For the first time in years, David felt something crack in the facade he had so carefully built. His voice wavered, barely audible. The officiant waited, the tension palpable. Claire's expression shifted, a flicker of concern breaking through her composed smile. "David?" she whispered, her voice soft but strained. The guest leaned forward slightly, the rustle of fabric, and held breaths filling the space. David swallowed hard, his heart pounding in his chest. He looked out at the faces staring back at him, then toward the rows of roses lining the aisle, the weight of his choices crashing over him. And then his gaze drifted, almost involuntarily, back to Amara. She sat still, her posture regal, her face calm but unreadable. For a moment, their eyes met. And in that moment, David realized he couldn't go through with it, not like this. "I can't," he said, his voice breaking the heavy silence. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd, and Claire froze, her bouquet trembling in her hands. "I can't do this." David repeated, louder this time, his voice steadier but filled with regret. Chaos ensued. Guests whispered frantically, some rising from their seats in disbelief. Claire's face fell, her confusion quickly replaced by humiliation. David stepped back from the altar, the weight of his confession sinking in. His perfect day, his perfect life, it was all crumbling before him. And for the first time, he wasn't sure if that was entirely a bad thing. The officiant's voice hung in the air, the expectant silence pressing down on David as he stood motionless at the altar. The words he had rehearsed so many times seemed to evaporate from his mind, replaced by a tumultuous storm of doubt. Claire's eyes searched his face, her warm smile faltering slightly as she waited for him to begin. David's throat tightened, and he swallowed hard, his grip on the ring in his hand becoming almost painful. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. His gaze drifted past Claire, past the sea of elegantly dressed guests, until it landed once again on Amara, sitting quietly in the second-to-last row. She wasn't doing anything extraordinary, yet her presence was magnetic. Her posture was poised, her expression calm, but her eyes, those eyes seemed to see straight through him, as if she could read every thought he was struggling to suppress. David exhaled shakily, a bead of sweat forming at his temple. He turned back to Claire, who was now visibly anxious, her smile replaced by a look of confusion. "David?" she prompted gently, her voice soft but laced with growing unease. He began, his voice trembling. He stopped, his chest tightening as if the weight of his decisions had finally become too heavy to bear. The officiant cleared his throat, trying to regain the rhythm of the ceremony. "David, do you take Claire to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Time seemed to freeze. David's mind raced, every fiber of his being urging him to speak the words, to go through with what he had meticulously planned. But in the depth of his heart, he knew the truth. He wasn't ready. He wasn't honest with himself, and marrying Claire now would be a lie too big to carry. "I can't," David whispered, his voice cracking under the weight of his confession. A collective gasp rippled through the guests, their shock palpable. Claire's bouquet trembled in her hands as her face turned pale. "What?" she breathed, her voice barely audible, her eyes wide with disbelief. David looked at her, his expression filled with guilt and regret. "I can't do this," he said louder, his voice steadier now, but no less pained. "I'm so sorry, Claire." The room erupted into hushed murmurs and the rustling of fabric as guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Claire took a step back, her perfect composure shattering as tears welled up in her eyes. "David," she said, her voice breaking, "what are you doing?" David struggled to find the words, his hands trembling. "This isn't right," he admitted. "Not for you. Not for me. I've been pretending that this is what I want, pretending that I've figured everything out, but I haven't." Claire's tears spilled over, streaking her carefully applied makeup. The pain in her expression was undeniable, but so was the anger. "You couldn't have figured this out before today?" she snapped, her voice sharp and filled with hurt. "I didn't know how to face it," David confessed. "I thought I could bury it under success, under this perfect life. But I can't. I'm so sorry, Claire. You deserve someone who knows what they want, and I'm not that person. Not yet." The silence that followed was suffocating. Claire stood frozen for a moment before turning and walking briskly down the aisle, her veil trailing behind her like a ghost. The guests parted, their whispers swelling as they watched her leave. David remained at the altar, the weight of his actions pressing down on him. For the first time in years, the image he had so carefully constructed had cracked, leaving him exposed and vulnerable. Amara, still seated, watched him with a mix of understanding and sadness. She didn't move, didn't say a word, but her presence felt louder than the murmurs filling the room. David closed his eyes, his chest heaving as he tried to steady his breath. He had undone everything in a single moment, and yet amidst the wreckage of the day, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: freedom. The quiet of the cafe was a stark contrast to the chaos of the day before. David sat at a small corner table, staring into his untouched cup of black coffee. The faint hum of conversation and the occasional clink of cups were the only sounds around him, but his mind was anything but still. He glanced up as the bell above the door jingled softly. Amara stepped in, her presence as steady and composed as ever. She wore a simple blouse and jeans, her natural elegance radiating despite the casual attire. For a moment, David felt a pang of regret, not for inviting her to the wedding, but for the way he had let his own bitterness consume him. "David," she greeted, her tone neutral but firm as she approached the table. "Amara," he replied, rising briefly before gesturing for her to sit. She settled across from him, folding her hands neatly on the table. "What did you want to say?" David hesitated, the words caught in his throat. "I owe you an apology," he finally began, his voice low. "For everything." Amara tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "Everything?" He nodded, his gaze dropping to the cup in front of him. "For the way I treated you back then, for making you feel like you weren't enough, and for inviting you to the wedding with less than pure intentions." Her lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't interrupt. "I thought I needed to prove something," David admitted. "To you, to myself, to everyone. I wanted you to see what you gave up, but instead all I did was realize how much I still have to figure out." Amara's expression softened, though her voice remained steady. "David, the past is done. We both made mistakes. But you have to ask yourself, what are you trying to prove, and to whom?" Her words struck him like a blow, not because they were harsh, but because they were true. He looked up at her, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know, but I want to start being honest with myself and the people who matter." Amara studied him for a moment before nodding. "That's a good start, David. But remember, no one can define your worth except you." Her words lingered as she rose to leave, her presence calm yet powerful. David watched her go, the weight of her truth settling over him like a quiet storm. David remained seated in the cafe, staring at the empty seat Amara had vacated only moments ago. But before she could fully step away, she paused, as if reconsidering. Slowly, she turned back and approached the table once more. "David," she said softly, her tone less guarded now, "there's something you need to understand before I go." He looked up at her, his eyes clouded with a mix of regret and longing. "I'm listening," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Amara slid into the seat opposite him again, leaning forward slightly, her gaze steady and unflinching. "You've spent so much of your life chasing an idea of success," she began. "But success, David, isn't about the things you own, the people you impress, or even the victories you think you've achieved." He frowned, her words sinking deeper than he expected. "Then what is it about?" he asked quietly. "It's about living in alignment with who you are," Amara said firmly. "Your values, your purpose, your truth. You can have everything the world says you should want, money, power, prestige, but if it doesn't come from a place of authenticity, it'll never make you happy." David's shoulders slumped slightly as he absorbed her words. "I thought that building this life, proving myself, would fill the emptiness," he admitted. "But it hasn't." Amara nodded, her expression softening. "That emptiness isn't something you can fill by looking outward. It's about looking inward and being honest about what truly matters to you. Stop trying to prove something to people who don't even care. Live for yourself, David." He exhaled deeply, as though her words had released a weight he hadn't even realized he was carrying. "I don't even know where to start," he confessed. Amara smiled faintly, her eyes filled with a mixture of empathy and resolve. "Start small, make choices that reflect your heart, not your ego, and stop running from the things that scare you. Growth comes from facing them." As she rose to leave, she rested a hand briefly on his shoulder. "You still have time, David, but remember, it's not about what you have, it's about who you are." And with that, she walked away, leaving David sitting in the quiet cafe, her words echoing in his mind. For the first time in years, he felt something stir within him, a faint but unmistakable hope. The morning light spilled through the tall windows of David's office, casting long shadows on the minimalist decor. The once bustling penthouse felt quieter these days. Not empty, but purposeful. Papers were spread across the desk, not contracts for multi-million-dollar deals, but proposals for local charities and community projects. David leaned back in his chair, staring at the email on his screen. It was a simple notification from a small nonprofit he had recently funded, a thank you note detailing how his contribution had helped renovate a community center in an underprivileged neighborhood. For the first time in years, the satisfaction he felt wasn't tied to the size of a deal or the prestige of an event. It was genuine, pure, and deeply fulfilling. His journey had started small. After that fateful conversation with Amara, David had taken her advice to heart. He began reaching out to local organizations, offering both financial support and his own time. At first, it felt strange, even daunting. But the more he immersed himself, the more he realized how disconnected he had been from the world around him. One of his earliest projects was a mentorship program for underprivileged youth. Sitting in a room full of eager teenagers, David shared not the polished version of his success, but the raw truth of his failures, his missteps, and the lessons he had learned. He found their questions refreshing, their optimism infectious. "You've really been through all that?" a young boy named Marcus asked, his wide eyes filled with disbelief. David chuckled, nodding. "More than you'd think. But the important part isn't where you start, it's where you're willing to go." The boy's smile in response was small but genuine, and David realized that moments like this mattered far more than any boardroom applause ever could. As weeks turned into months, David's involvement deepened. He helped fund scholarships for students who couldn't afford college, partnered with food banks to provide meals for struggling families, and even joined Amara's organization on a few initiatives. Their paths occasionally crossed during meetings or events, and while their interactions remained professional, there was an unspoken understanding between them, a shared commitment to something greater than themselves. One evening, after volunteering at a local shelter, David sat on a bench overlooking the city skyline. It was a view he had admired countless times before, but tonight it felt different. The glittering lights didn't represent power or wealth. They symbolized lives, millions of stories, each as valuable as his own. His phone buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. It was a message from Marcus, the boy from the mentorship program. "Mr. Harper, thank you for believing in me. I got into the program I applied for. Couldn't have done it without your advice." David smiled, a wave of warmth spreading through him. He typed a quick response. "You earned it, Marcus. Keep pushing forward. You've got this." As he put the phone away, David realized he no longer felt the gnawing emptiness that had plagued him for years. His life wasn't perfect, nor was it free from challenges. But for the first time, he was building something real, something meaningful. He glanced up at the stars, his thoughts briefly drifting back to Amara's words. "It's not about what you have, it's about who you are." David inhaled deeply, letting the crisp night air fill his lungs. He had spent so long chasing an image of success, only to find that true fulfillment came from living authentically and giving back. This was his different path. And though it had taken him years to find it, he knew he was finally on the right one. The gentle hum of the train rocked Amara as she gazed out of the window. Rolling hills, dotted with small homes and endless greenery, came into view as the city skyline faded behind her. She had always loved this journey home, the gradual retreat from the fast-paced world into the slower, steadier rhythm of her community. But today, it felt different. Amara leaned back in her seat, her journal open on her lap. Pages were filled with notes and sketches of her latest project, a community garden that would double as a learning space for children. It wasn't a grand undertaking by any means, but it was one that mattered to her. Her thoughts drifted, unbidden, to the events of the past week. David's wedding, or rather, what should have been his wedding, played out in her mind like a vivid movie. She had seen him at his most vulnerable, the polished facade he wore cracking under the weight of his truth. For years, she had carried a sense of guilt and resentment over how things had ended between them. But seeing him take responsibility for his choices, even in front of hundreds of guests, had brought her an unexpected sense of peace. When the train pulled into the small station near her hometown, Amara gathered her belongings and stepped onto the platform. The familiar scent of earth and blooming flowers greeted her, along with the distant sound of children laughing. She smiled to herself. She was home. Walking through the narrow streets, Amara greeted neighbors and familiar faces. Many stopped her to ask about her recent trip, and she shared snippets of her work and the ideas she had brought back with her. She didn't mention David or the wedding. It wasn't necessary. That chapter was hers to carry quietly, a story that had taught her far more about herself than she ever expected. Later that evening, Amara sat on the porch of her modest home, a steaming cup of tea in hand. The golden hues of the setting sun painted the fields in warm light, and the hum of crickets began to rise. She took a deep breath, the weight of the past few years finally lifting. For so long, she had wondered if she had made the right choice in walking away from David. Their love had been real, but it had also been suffocating, tangled in his ambitions and her refusal to sacrifice her values. Now, with the clarity of hindsight, she realized that leaving wasn't just the right choice, it had been necessary. The person she had become in the years since their breakup was someone she was proud of. She had built a life centered on purpose and impact, not wealth or status. And while she knew she would always have a soft spot for the man David once was, she understood that they had grown in different directions. Her phone buzzed beside her, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from one of the community leaders she worked with. "Amara, the supplies for the garden arrived today. We're ready to start building whenever you are." A smile spread across her face as she typed a quick reply. "That's wonderful. I'll be there first thing tomorrow." Setting the phone aside, Amara let her gaze wander to the horizon. She thought of the children who would learn and play in the garden, the families who would gather there, and the connections it would foster. For a brief moment, her thoughts flickered back to David. She wondered how he was adjusting to his new path, whether he had found the courage to live authentically as he had promised. But the thought didn't linger long. It wasn't out of indifference. On the contrary, she wished him nothing but growth and happiness. But Amara had learned one of life's most important lessons. The past shapes us, but it doesn't define us. She had closed that chapter, not with bitterness or regret, but with gratitude for the person it had helped her become. As the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon, Amara leaned back in her chair, cradling her tea. The future felt open and full of possibility, a canvas waiting for her to paint her next story. She didn't need to look back anymore. The past was exactly where it belonged, behind her. And for the first time in years, Amara felt truly, unequivocally free. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring tales of loyalty, love, and the incredible bonds between humans and animals. Join us as we share stories that remind us of what truly matters in life. Hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a moment.